ultimately, when you get to a certain level of success, executives aren't incented to really drive the org, right? And they're incented to keep their jobs and their big paychecks. And you don't do that by taking risk.
I remember the first time that we met, Scott, you actually blew my mind. You said that the majority of private equity companies actually think their CFOs aren't up to par. Can you unpack that gap for us?
I can, because he was the one that blew my mind too. So this was a conversation that started with a talent partner at a very large private equity shop, top 5 shop. And that talent partner was new to role, and after reviewing their rosters, said I would fire 80% of the CFOs on my company.
Talking about like stepping into big shoes. And you said to me that in many companies, the CFO is more important than the CEO. And I mean, that's the kind of take that would start a very tense executive offsite. You got to break it down for me. Why do you believe that? And how can CFOs lean into that? Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome back to the Run the Numbers podcast, where I talk to someone who has been studying, recruiting, and coaching CFOs for a couple decades now. That's right. Scott Engler of LinkedIn fame. Yeah, he's got some hitters on LinkedIn. He is the CEO and founder of Sync CXO and PE-Xcelerate. And he's not one who's shy on opinions. Like this one, in many companies, the CFO is more important than the CEO. Yes, you heard that right. And in the world of private equity, where stakes are high and timelines are short, the CFO often wears every hat but the hard hat: strategist, operator, talent whisperer, storyteller, and occasionally therapist. We'll unpack why so many PE firms quietly admit their CFOs are not cutting it, what separates the ones who thrive, and how mental models, not spreadsheets, are the real superpower. Plus, how to incept a decision without making it feel like finance is barking orders. If you've ever had to manage up, sideways, or just survive the executive offsite, this one is for you. No shortage of entertainment and insights. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. Well, if you've listened to this podcast before, you definitely know that I think it's cool to be a fan of business. I'm obsessed with researching how the best companies operate, and specifically how they manage their money. And I've learned that a company's financial stack can make the difference between world domination and obscurity. That's why I want to tell you about Brex, because I want you to rule the world. Brex is an impressive financial services and software company that has grown immensely since it was founded in 2017. In just the last year alone, Brex accelerated customer acquisition by 50%, with 91% growth in enterprise customers. And there's good reason that over 30,000 companies from startups to enterprises have flocked to Brex. Brex offers the world's smartest corporate card on a full-stack global platform that is everything CFOs need to manage their finances on an elite level. Plus, they offer modern banking and treasury, as well as intuitive expenses and accounting automation, bill pay, and travel. Wow, it's all on the roster whenever you need it. Brex grows with you. CFOs tell me all the time that Brex makes it easy to control spend before it happens, automate annoying tasks, and optimize their finances. Because listen, at the end of the day, Brex helps them make every dollar count. So if you're a fan of smart businesses too, check out Brex at brex.com/metrics. That's brex.com/metrics. So if you listen to this podcast, you'll know that I am incredibly passionate about the FP&A space, because that's the route I went to get to CFO. And I want to tell you about a tool that has exploded over the past few years. It's called Aleph. And I remember getting outbounded by them about 2.5 years ago, and I actually took the bait because they claimed to be able to do a demo with my live data, with me right there on the call. And so I had to see it to believe it. And it was the founder running demos back then. Shout out Albert, hope you're listening. And he connected my NetSuite and built my P&L using their Excel add-in in like 15 minutes. And I was really impressed. Since then, Aleph has gone on to raise money from some of the top VCs out there, and they've built an impressive roster of customers. Many of their customers have been on the podcast, like the CFO at Turo, 8 Sleep, and Zapier. They're all really big champions and supporters of Aleph like me. But it's not just an Excel add-in. Aleph also allows finance teams to work with their live cross-system data using Google Sheets and their web app. And that's cool because it gives teams the option to support a wide range of needs and workflows like budgeting, forecasting, and variance analysis. And speaking of variance analysis, they're doing some really cool things with AI-powered variance analysis. It basically allows you to figure out what's going on and why, and it takes the time that you'd usually spend from hours to minutes. It's really cool. So I highly recommend checking them out and taking them up on that demo or trial, just like I did back in the day. And you can learn more and get started at getaleph.com/run. That is getaleph.com/run. Tell them CJ sent you. All right, I got to get up on my soapbox for a sec here. Everybody's talking about AI powered this and automated that. But here's the thing about revenue recognition. It's not just about moving data around. It's about getting it right, full stop. So RightRev is laser focused on one thing, RevRec that auditors actually trust. See, there's a difference between automating revenue processes and automating revenue recognition correctly. RightRev was actually built by the godfather of RevRec, who understands ASC 606 compliance, audit controls, data validation, and the flexibility needed for complex B2B contracts. We're not trying to be your billing system or your ERP. We're the revenue recognition engine that sits between your contracts and your financials, making sure every dollar is recognized correctly, on time, every time. Companies like Snowflake and Logic Monitor don't just need fast revenue reporting, they need revenue reporting that's audit ready from day one. And that's honestly where RightRev shines. And what I love about RightRev is they're not out there trying to be everything to everyone and just slap some, AI slop on top of it. While everyone is building these massive platforms that do everything in a kind of mediocre fashion, RightRev does one thing exceptionally well. They make sure your revenue recognition is bulletproof. Ready to stop gambling with your RevRec? Visit RightRev.com to see how we make complex revenue simple. That's RightRev.com, where revenue recognition actually works. Scott, thanks for joining the pod today.
Oh, great to see you, CJ. I've been following you for a while since Steve connected us. So
I know.
It's my honor.
Steve Isom, he's going to have to pay me to sponsor him at some point because, that guy's like the mayor of the CFO world.
he has a lot of connections. The thing about Steve is everyone loves Steve.
Oh, yeah.
There's something about being really good and really likable that he's nailed. I'm working on the likable factor a little bit.
Steve Isom for president 2040. We'll see if it pans out. Scott, you've had this amazing career that's kind of sat at the nexus of developing top talent for the CEO role, CFO role, the C-suite. You've been heavily involved in it, and you've had a front row seat to how the CFO role has evolved over the last really 2 decades. You were at CEB, now Gartner, and you're studying industry trends there. And now you're recruiting and placing a lot of these finance leaders for private equity-backed companies. And so to kick things off, I'd love to hear what you think about the role and how it's changed over the last 5 to 10 years and some of the big shifts you've seen.
Yeah, I think that, we kind of divvied up into 3 layers. There's governance, guidance, and performance. Right? Governance, you could think of, I actually started at CEB in 2007, so dating myself a little bit, right? But, that was post SOX, right? SOX compliance, very much compliance governance flavor to the CFO role at that point. It actually kind of constricted a bit as far as the strategic elements of the CFO role right after SOX. But if you think about it back then, you got paid as a CFO for the governance aspects of the job, right? There's a couple things which, by the way, they never change, right? You got to keep the trains running on time. You have the fiduciary responsibility. You've got to manage risk, manage covenants, all that stuff, right? That stuff is all still there. It hasn't gone away, right? But the flavor back then of the CFO, as it related to the business, was a little more oppositional, which was always interesting to me. It was, we want a CFO to counterbalance our CEO, right? The CEO's got all these ideas all over the place. Chief sales officer at the time, chief revenue officer now, over both, right? But, they want to go, they have all these great ideas. And the CFO is almost like this Dr. No, counterbalance. I've got to be the one who stops all these people from doing all this crazy stuff, and we spend all the money and we go broke, right? And that was kind of an accepted norm back then, to be a counterbalance. And it still is, right? Where I think of it now is it's gone more from oppositional, where, you have this perspective and you want to throw all this money at growth and hire all these people, and I've got to keep the clamps on everything, to we're actually looking at the problem through the same lens, right? And we're helping each other to make better decisions versus you're arguing for X and I'm going to argue back for Y. And so when you start graduating from governance, right, you get to what we would call a guidance, which is Gartner. We pitched guidance for a long time. Guidance is, helping the business with data, helping frame problems, right? Helping interpret what's going on in the environment. And that became really the differentiator between high performing CFOs and low performing CFOs. Then I'm going to layer on performance, which actually has much more of a private equity flavor to it, but it's really becoming true, I think, of the CFO at all different levels. And by the way, I don't ever contend that the CFO job is the same at every level, right? It's not, right? There's different aspects to it. But the performance level, I use this analogy in our PE-Xcelerate course, right? If governance is you're making sure that the team payroll is okay, that you're in compliance, right, with the salary cap and all that kind of stuff. The guidance is you're actually getting in and deconstructing rosters against your competitors, positioning yourself vis-a-vis against competitors, et cetera. The performance CFO is you start playing the game in the first quarter, your game plan goes to shit. What are you going to do, right? Now you've got to have a CFO who knows the business so well that they can jump in and diagnose quickly. They're not going to wait for the numbers to show up 6 months down the road and then to do some variance analysis and then to go beat people up for not hitting their numbers, right? That's the old kind of methodology that used to happen. You've got to have that kind of foresight, right? Through the windshield foresight of what's happening, where you can interpret what's going on and help the business make the right decisions, course correct as you go, right? That's a performance CFO. And that's especially in the PE world, what they expect now of a CFO. They expect you to be operationally dirty, right? Like if you're I've worked with CFOs in every form. One of my favorites was we had a manure farm.
Literally?
We had a CFO of, and they're $100 million manure farm. Well, that CFO got on the truck, right? That CFO had constant conversations with product, with customer, right? It's that intimate knowledge as well as mastery of the numbers that allows you to play that well as your credibility. And it's an evolving skill set, right? And now you can add we'll go to the 4.0 level, which is the combination of what we're doing with cross-functional data and AI together and how that all interacts. And so we're probably getting into that next act, the 4.0 act, in the next couple of years.
What's really fascinating is it seems like it's evolved from hey, we need an adult in the room to make sure the kids don't mess all this up, to the CFO is now the one who's pushing the pace and actually out in front of the CEO in many cases.
So I could not agree with this more. We have in our PE-Xcelerate program, we have what's called the performance leader. And one of the things we talk about is cadence, right? Operational pacing, that the CFO has to drive the pacing because the CFO, especially in private equity, the importance of numbers, all business, right? At the end of the day, comes down to numbers, which is why the CFO is so critically important, right? But if the CFO is not driving the pacing, is not understanding what the cadence needs to look like. And that's what, we actually talked to JMI about, right? Which Harry Gruner is up there going, we love slow competitors, right? And one of the things he had message for the room is you need to drive the pace. And so there was an operating partner who will not be named of a very large PE shop. And he said, look, you cannot be in the backseat and survive anymore as a CFO. At least not survive well. You've got to be in the front seat. You've got to be the one in the ear, helping to guide the CEO, helping to guide the deal team, the operating partner, et cetera. And really, I don't know, we call it a gyroscope, right? You're spinning really fast. The company's not moving that fast, but you're spinning really fast. And so 100%, I think that is where the A player is, right? Not necessarily your B players, C players, D players.
I remember talking to Zach Jallo, who's the CFO of Flowcast, and he was talking about how he came up at Adobe along the point of when they were making that transition from perpetual license to subscription, which was a huge mission to undergo. And their CFO at the time, whose name is escaping me, but he had basically said listen, it's my job to pave the road for whatever the CEO's vision is. I'm going to get out in front of it and help you make the proper risk-adjusted bets along the way, which is a total mindset shift from I'm going to play goalie and wait to shut down whatever your shitty idea you bring to me is.
But when you come in, especially in a takeover, majority takeover situation, right? You are going to have to shut down some shitty shit. Yeah, 100%, right? And it's also helping that CEO understand the lay of the land in a way that he or she doesn't currently. Look, CEOs are fantastic, right? If they're A player CEOs. but they have to have that counterbalance. And I don't mean counterbalance oppositionally, just someone who can help them interpret, right? Navigate the environment. And I think that's where all the A-player CFOs are going now.
I love how we're honing in on the kind of private equity backed CFO here, because there are so many out there. There are actually more of those, I realized, going to a JMI conference, looking around the room, there were like 52 private equity backed portfolio CFOs there. I was like, no one's making content or helping to educate people to like the extent that they need. And I know that you're really passionate about that. And I remember the first time that we met, Scott, you actually blew my mind. You said that the majority of private equity companies actually think their CFOs aren't up to par. Can you unpack? Can you unpack that gap for us?
I can, because he was the one that blew my mind too. So this was a conversation that started with a talent partner at a very large private equity shop, top 5 shop. And that talent partner was new to role, and after reviewing their rosters, said I would fire 80% of the CFOs of my company. But you can't, because there's a lack of supply of A-player CFOs running around out there. So you can't go do that. But like, when I heard that point, like, given my research background, I'm like, okay, this is a big problem that needs like some kind of root causing around it. Like, why does this problem exist? And so as I had these conversations, then I would go to every other large private equity firm when I have these conversations, and I'd say, here's what we're hearing. What do you think? And, one of them said, no, I think it's 10% are really A players. 10% are truly A players. So 1 out of 10 that really lean in, drive the pace, mastery of the numbers, mastery of the business. You have that enterprise-wide view, who have the relationships, who drive the stakeholder ecosystem, right? There's a lot in there, right? So it's actually hard to be an A player. And there's been no breeding ground, no training ground for it.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. This episode of Run the Numbers is brought to you by Navan, the all-in-one travel and expense solution. CFOs and finance leaders, let's be honest here. Your T&E process is broken. Manual reconciliations waste valuable time, policy violations drain money, and limited visibility creates unnecessary risk. Nobody likes that. Navan cuts through these problems, giving finance teams the clarity and control needed to close with confidence, faster and with fewer headaches. Connect your existing eligible Visa, MasterCard, or American Express cards directly to Navan and keep all your card rewards and banking relationships. Get real-time expense tracking, automated policy enforcement, and AI-powered reconciliation that works. Companies like Anthropic, Unilever, and Zoom trust Navan to manage travel spend smarter and increase compliance. Are you ready to modernize your T&E process? Visit navan.com/runthenumbers for your demo today. That's navan.com/runthenumbers. Tell them CJ sent you. They'll hook you up. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Bull market, bear market. Rates will rise, rates will fall. Can someone please just invent a crystal ball already? Until then, over 40,000 businesses have future-proofed their companies with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. Whether you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If you listen to this podcast, you'll know I ask CFOs all the time to rep their tech stacks, and I would say almost every one of them use NetSuite. And that's what I would use too. Whether you're a company earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/metrics. The guide is free to you. That is netsuite.com/metrics. Ooh, yeah, it's netsuite.com/metrics. Please, guys, I really need this. As a CFO, you're expected to bring clarity to everything, including how your company manages ownership. The tools you use should make that easier, not harder. But when they come with hidden fees, data you can't always trust, and support you can't rely on, you end up with more frustration than clarity. That's where Pulley comes in. Pulley is the cap table management platform built for finance leaders who need accurate, decision-ready data from a system that works for your business, not against it. With Pulley, you get intuitive workflows, audit-ready reporting, and support you can count on, all backed by predictable pricing you can plan around, so you can stay compliant and make smarter decisions about your company's future. Manage everything from fundraise modeling to ASC 718 reporting, to custom liquidity programs, all on one trusted platform. Hundreds of high-growth companies like Linear, Fathom, and Runway trust Pulley to help turn ownership into a strategic advantage. And joining them is now easier than ever. You can switch to Pulley in as little as 5 days. And for a limited time, they're offering 25% off your first year. To claim your exclusive offer, visit pulley.com/mostlymetrics. That is pulley.com/mostlymetrics. Pulley.com/mostlymetrics. Yeah, there's no playbook on really how to become a CFO. That was one of the reasons why I started writing Mostly Metrics. I was like, I don't know what I don't know. I'm going to try to memorialize it here and answer my own dumb questions. And then I honed in more on the private equity persona, and I launched Looking for Leverage, because that's like a whole different bag of burritos that you're trying to go through and solve. And like, why is the PE-backed environment so much different than perhaps to like the hypergrowth VC? Why does that take like a different type of CFO?
Well, it's a different animal. Yeah, it's a great question, because we're working on different training frameworks now for different private equity firms who play on the VC side all the way up to LBO. It's a different job. Like let's take your VC hypergrowth, right? You've been there, right? What are your top 3 tasks? Usually building for scale, managing the founder.
It's don't run out of money. That's number one.
Raising money.
Yeah. I mean, I worked at places for the majority of my career that I wouldn't know what to do with $1 of profit if it hit me in the face. So number one was don't run out of money. Number 2 was like help. I thought of it like take whatever the CEO doesn't want to do off his or her plate. And number 3 was I found drive the pace, which nobody told me to do, but I instantly discovered when I arrived. Like, I think I have to be the one to get people to move a bit faster.
Yeah, no, that's so it's great. Everyone's experience is a little bit different, right? But if you think about that, now you juxtapose that against getting into an LBO situation where you're taking over a matured company that flatlined, right? Which is, that's a fair amount. There are carve outs and different flavors of whatever. But that's a huge change management lift, right? And it's a culture lift, because you have a culture that's stratified. You've got a culture that's got used to doing a certain way of doing things. We just had this conversation, by the way, with our CFO group the other night. We had the cohort together, and we literally had the conversation, how come a performance culture is so hard? And one of the conclusions is ultimately when you get to a certain level of success, executives aren't incented to really drive the org, right? And they're incented to keep their jobs and their big paychecks. And you don't do that by taking risk.
That's interesting. Can you say more about that? Because it's like you almost get to a point where you go into protectionism more so than you're incented to push the org forward, which is weird because you're at a place that like it only exists because of risks.
Yeah. But it's counterintuitive, but it makes perfect sense, right? Because once you get to a certain level of where the company's running well, making money, you don't get paid to upset the apple cart, right? Jack Welch had a line that was like, a lemming doesn't live a very interesting life, but no individual lemming ever gets shot, right? You can't find that one lemming. You stick your head up though. And now let's take a big initiative, right? In a company where you might be hitting the end of your S curve, right? You need to reinflect your S curve. You've got to take some bets that are risky bets. But what happens when a senior leader takes on that risky bet and it doesn't work, because most of them aren't going to work?
It's your name on it.
Your name on it, right? You're the failure. And so where's the incentive there? Your incentive is actually to play it safe. And your incentive is to keep the paycheck. And by the way, it's good to feed your kids. It's good to have, your 401k and all of that.
Yeah.
And you almost get this thing where if you're the person who is the true driver of growth, you're viewed as the person who's upsetting the apple cart.
Right. And I think that in the background of all this, especially within private equity environments, that if you're really going to shake something up, it may take 18 months to even 3 years for that change to truly catalyze. Yep. In the holding period, you may not be there anymore for when like the change shows up. So there's also like this selfish thing where you're almost incentivized to make smaller short-term bets that show progress rather than, to your point, like revolutionize what you're doing, because like I may not be here at that point anyway.
Yeah, and you've got to look at time horizons, right? You can't make a big strategic bet that it's not going to pay off if your hold period is, 2 years. It's going to end in 2 years. I've seen CFOs argue to get the hold period extended before. It doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah.
But now, think about this situation though, right? Where it has been with private equity, because we've been in this multiple expansion environment where we just pay more for the house, right? The housing market's growing. So if you put a small addition on the house, you're still going to make money on the thing, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so you could get away with that. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out now over the next couple of years, because you're starting to see PE firms get much more operational, get in the shorts of the operations of the business. They want more operational CFOs. And so perhaps some of that goes away. Now, private equity is by far a better place to be if you are a performance-driven person, because you are operating at a high cadence with a reporting structure and a reporting cadence to the private equity firm, right? And you are being held accountable for things that maybe you weren't held accountable for before you're bought by private equity. And so private equity usually is a better place for people who are performance mindset, but it doesn't mean it doesn't suffer the same ills, right? It's still hard. And to your point, if you're going to make a big bet, you got to engineer that bet so that the timeline is in line with what's possible. You don't want to be the CFO who gets fired at the 2.5 year mark, and then someone else finishes your job and then they get the payout.
Yeah. I think of Sam Hinkie of the Sixers when they tanked for a bunch of years, and everyone's like, this is the dumbest strategy ever. And then 2 seasons later, it actually worked and all the players were great. You got Joel Embiid. Ben Simmons wasn't that great, but it still worked out in the long term. I digress. Scott, you mentioned that companies want an operational CFO.
Yeah.
With what you're seeing in the talent market, do you feel that the CFO is eating up a lot of the roles that a traditional COO used to have?
So I think it's always been that way in mid-market. I've only worked in mid-market, right? I haven't worked in large enterprise. I'd say the largest companies that I worked with on a regular basis were that 750 a year range, in the lower end, maybe 75. So that's kind of my experience. And in that arena, it has mostly been a arena that doesn't have a COO, right? We benchmarked it a few years ago. It was 30% of companies have a COO. I think that number's down. I guess it'd be 20%. But regardless, because it doesn't have all these sort of mechanisms that larger enterprise has, there's this big gap into who's driving strategic execution. Who owns strategic execution? Well, you might say the CEO, but they're really not. Okay, so it might be a COO, but you generally don't have one. So who owns it? Well, it's kind of this, it's this conglomeration of your business leaders, your CEO, you get together and, CFO's got to drive that stuff, right? The CFO also has to understand the operational workings, because, and you can tell, I get all hyped up about this, but the CFO is the one who has enterprise-wide view. You can see across the enterprise, you're not biased. Everyone else has a bias except maybe the CHRO. And even your CEOs, they're going to come from the product side. They're going to come from the go-to-market side. Some come from the finance side. They're going to have their own biases. And so the CFO, if they're not playing that de facto COO role, they're in the back seat to a certain extent. And so if you're not leaning into that, and I always say to CFOs, you got to grow into the bigness of the role, because especially in a mid-sized company, you could be everything from co-CEO to a controller.
Let's hit on that, because talking about stepping into big shoes, I love people who are on the corner of something that's potentially controversial. And you said to me that in many companies, the CFO is more important than the CEO. And that's the kind of take that would start a very tense executive offsite. You got to break it down for me. Why do you believe that? And how can CFOs lean into that?
It's a good question. I'll give you a couple points of context for that. First of all, one is conversations with operating partners. They're basically we value the CFO more than CEO, period. Full stop. They believe they can work with an A-player CFO and a B-C player CEO, and it can work. They don't think the reverse is true, right? So, and that again is because numbers are the language of a private equity investment. Yes. Ultimately, this all has to translate into something you get paid for by investors, right? And ultimately, this has to have the operational intimacy aspect. In other words, the numbers you have to know what makes up the numbers and all that, right? From the bottom level. CFO is the only one who does that. So that's one thing. There was a study, and I was going to look up the source. I forgot to. It was in, I think, our October newsletter. But that it asked investors to rank of 15 categories what is most important to your investment. CEO competence was 7. CFO competence was 2. Number
way.
1 was market.
Wow.
And now I'll give you another example. There's a friend of mine who works at a really fast growing $200 million company. They're unicorn, doing fantastic. But the CFO is driving that bus, right? The CFO is actually one with a higher EQ. The CEO is a product person who was a founder who hasn't shown the ability to actually flex in different ways. And the CFO has shown that ability. And so people are just naturally drawn to that CFO. Now, I think there's room for 2A players. It doesn't have to be a hierarchy, but it's fun to say the CFO is worth more than CEO because it sparks a little bit of really. Well, wait, I thought the chief executive would be that one, but I was talking to this guy who's head of sales, and he was like, no, it's the CFO who brings people together, who helps them understand problems differently. The CEO is a driver in his specific realm, but he hasn't built the competencies across. And even if you brought in a professional CEO, right, which usually happens in private equity as they invest, right, they'll transition out of founder CEO and get to, a pro. That person is probably not going to have that full set of skills either. So you have to have both people really flexing across the board in those muscles. But if I ask, which I did, by the way, if I ask investors, how much value does a CFO create? And I put out a benchmark, right? You've got a $250 million a year SaaS company. It's a rule of 40 company. How much value creation comes from the CFO role is possible to get from the CFO role? What would you benchmark that at?
I bet like a great CFO can add at least, I think that they should be minimally adding 10% in enterprise value, but I think like a great one can get you to like 30, 40% uplift.
Now think about that. Okay, now that's great. Like we'll just use your numbers, right? So one of our faculty members who teaches one of our courses, she's at a $2.4 billion valuation right now. So how much is she worth if she added 30%?
My goodness, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions, in some cases, billions, right? And so one of our faculty members is in Insight Partners, right? And she was at a prior company, and her CEO said, told her point blank, you created a B for us. So now you get to see, like, because of where the CFO has all these touch points where the CEO doesn't, right? And they have all this operational intimacy, and they have to know, and they have to understand how that juxtaposes against the investment environment and how to guide towards that investment environment. It becomes like it's not that hard to see why a CFO becomes so important, as well as just managing, the fundamentals of the business.
And Scott, you've mentioned that the CFO has to wear a lot of hats, if we're being real. De facto COO, talent champion, master storyteller. I mean, basically like the whole Village People lineup minus the construction helmet. So how should a CFO prioritize these roles without losing their mind or losing impact?
Well, one, first of all, I love the Village People analogy. Number two, you need your construction hard hat if you're the CFO.
You probably do.
That's not the hat you can leave off.
Bring your own helmet to work.
You're coming in. You're gonna have to take some shots to the noggin at some point, right? But here's the thing: is I don't think they're actually different hats. Like wearing HR is a different hat, right? But being a talent champion, gosh, I mean, if you're at a SaaS company, the benchmark is 70% of your spend goes to people, right? How much of your output is generated by your people? Why? How can you be a great CFO without really being a champion of talent, understanding talent, how it works, having a great relationship with your CEO and your CHRO, right? There's so much value that just gets lost if the CFO doesn't play that role, right? So, or have that skill. And I'll call these tools rather than hats, right?
Yeah.
Now, Storyteller, I feel like I'm doing the reverse interview, but if you're guessing working with senior leaders, how many truly have a financial mindset of leaders you've worked with? What percentage? And I'm talking about your CHROs, your CMO, et cetera.
Oh, maybe a quarter if I'm lucky. And the greatest product leaders and HR leaders I've ever worked with, they understand how the company makes money, which is like such as like a stupid thing to say. Like, do you know how we make money here? You'd be surprised how many people in the C-suite, like you tell them you're a B2B SaaS model and like they still don't understand like how long the average contract length is, when we get paid for it. If certain months we have more business than the others. And these are things that like you would just assume. You got to this level somehow. You should probably know the cadence of the business.
And they don't. And that number is probably generous, right? It's probably like, it's because we did a board study a few years back, and these are board members, not private equity boards, which are a little more financially savvy, but your average board member, it was 1 out of 5 that had actually like real financial knowledge. That's a board member. So then extrapolate that to your senior team, where you came up through the CHRO ranks, the CMO ranks, and you get to this point of numbers are not really a great way to communicate to people.
No, they suck at that.
Yeah. Where numbers aren't a great way to communicate, right? And so you've got to be good at storytelling and narrative. The way we learn is narrative. I can't remember the guy who's the CFO at Monday.com. I don't know if you follow him.
Oh, Eliron Glazer, friend of the pod.
Yeah, he had a great post the other day talking about how he presents, right? He starts with story, and I said, look, you footnote with numbers, but you describe with narrative, right? And numbers you punctuate and you footnote with. And even then, you don't want to necessarily give hard numbers. You want to give trends. People understand trends. People understand, things are moving in this direction, that direction, or this is juxtaposed against that. But if you lead with numbers, your brain actually, this is a funny thing in working with CFOs for years, right? You get into all the psychology about why things don't work. If I told you a number and I said, we had a 42% growth rate last year. Now, the first thing that comes to mind for you is probably not, wow, that's an incredible growth rate. The first thing that comes to mind for you is probably like, well, how'd you calculate that number? What went into the number, right? And what's the context of the number? Were you growing at 100% the year before? Now it's 42%. Well,
and what was the goal?
Yeah, what was the goal? Like, right? And so whenever you bring a number up, that's what happens in people's brains. Like, we think we're telling them like the gospel number, but the thing that happens when they see a number is they start doing all this questioning, right? And what happens is you end up with a lot of pushback. And I don't know if you've ever had the situation where just people argue over where the number came from.
Oh, yeah. You've lost the room at that point. Just cancel the meeting. Like, it doesn't even matter.
Done, right? So, you lead with context and story. And so, one of the things like we talk about in our Accelerate too is doing an upside down business review where you lead with narratives, right? You lead with narrative first. Numbers are 7th, right? In that construct. Well, it depends how many things you want to touch on, right? But by the time anyone who does an upside down review, you almost never need to discuss the numbers, because what you really want is for them to discuss the environment, what's changing the environment, what needs to be done. And by that point, your brain has probably got to the point of where it can recognize why the number is what it is. And so being a storyteller is like, it's an incredibly non-negotiable tool for a CFO. If you're going to get out there and just do numbers, you're literally inhibiting the brain's ability to do something useful. Where if you lead with context and narrative, they can then put the number into that narrative, they can do something with it. And so I look at these more as like toolboxes, right? Or tools in the toolbox. And like we talk about enterprise leadership, transformational leadership, performance leadership, insight leadership, right? And each of these are kind of sets of tools. And, a lot of CFOs get them from battle scars, right? They get them because they effed up on their last gig and they realized that thing didn't work and that they turned a lot of people off because of the way that they went about it. And so they decided to change. Yeah. So it's a lot, but I would argue that it's much more rewarding to play that kind of a role, right? To be the storyteller, to be a talent champion. If you can listen to your, which has been the constant one over the last 5 years, right? Your chief revenue officer ask for more SDR headcount, right?
Yeah.
Which is probably every company period, right? That's probably happened at, right? But you can put that into the context of what you see from an overall talent perspective, like how does this fit into what we're doing? And you can ask some questions. That's, I think, where you become powerful. And I think the CFO, to a certain extent, omniscience is not the right word, but we have more knowledge than almost anyone in the organization as it relates to those 4 levels, right? Of investor level, portco level, the fund level, and your finance level, and what's happening down in the org.
Scott, what's an upside down review? You have my attention.
So it's where most reviews start with performance numbers, right?
Okay.
It's like, this is our goal. Here's where we are. The narrative upside down reviews starts with what are you seeing in the environment, right? And understanding because what you want to help people orient to the next decision, not the thing that they should have done 6 months ago, right?
Yeah.
And so you want to, we call it anticipatory business intelligence. That, I have all these like fun phrases I've developed that make no sense really to anyone, but I like to use them because I got to call them something, right? Or raising the BIQ, the business intelligence quotient of the organization. But my job as a CFO is to help you think about how to interpret the next thing that's coming, as well as where we are. I don't want you to go back to that number that we just did and lead with that, right? I want you to lead with what's thinking. And so an upside down review starts with narrative. And you can do this in many different ways, but usually narrative of what you're seeing in the environment, what's changed, risk and opportunity updates. What risks are we seeing? What opportunities do we see? Strategic execution. How are we going? How are we doing against our strategy initiatives, or however you think about strategy, or high level OKRs? Strategy gets to be a big mucky mess for most orgs. But then you can get down to the financials. You can look at talent next too, right? And look at your talent. And by the time you've had those 4 conversations, pretty much everyone knows what's going on and what to do going forward. And then the numbers then aren't going to anchor you. If I gave you that number that you missed last quarter, first of all, I'm anchoring the whole conversation, something that happened in the past. Second, it's going to limit the way you think, right? And so I don't want to limit the way my business leaders think. I want them to be thinking expansively. I want them to be thinking about the next thing. It gets into this whole idea of, can you help people build good mental models in a business and all that kind of stuff. But if you do upside down review, now it's not always possible if your sponsor, whatever that situation is. But if you can lead with what are you seeing in the environment? Like what are the lead indicators out there? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? How are we doing against our strategic initiatives? What does the change management look like? How's our talent evolving? You're always going to have the numbers.
Yeah. And I think there are appropriate times to lead with the number. Like Dave Kellogg has an excellent post. I think it's like, answer the question, just answer the fucking question. Like when a board member asks you something and they want a number, like give them the number, don't give them like this long winding narrative. But if you're trying to get buy-in from people, and like you said, we grew 42% last year, like that's a really terrible way to orient people to what you're trying to solve. So you want to start with the context of what's going on in like the larger macro environment or your competitive landscape. And then you want to work down through the context to the number. And like you said, by that point, they should know what's going on and have like the appropriate wherewithal to make an observation on their own. And it also makes it so like you don't pull up the defensiveness on like this historical number, which may be like poking somebody in the eye. Like, oh, we didn't do what we said we were going to do.
Yeah, it does, right? And you orient people to the past. You orient them to something that's probably, most of the time what's brought up are variances that aren't positive variances, right? Even though we want to lead with good positive stuff. And so, you anchor people in a place where, the brain can't. I don't know if you've ever seen like the brain on threat versus the brain on reward. It's some cool work by Dr. David Rock. I don't know what kind of doctor he is, but he reads.
He's a chiropractor.
I learned this at my last adjustment. But he talks about, when the brain is on threat, the brain actually can't think expansively. It
shuts down. I think I've seen it like there's less pathways for it to go through. Yep.
It does. It shuts down your prefrontal cortex and it activates your more emotional parts of your brain. It makes you dumb. And like the last thing you want to do as a CFO is make everyone dumb. Right?
But deer in the headlights, like nothing's going on upstairs right now. Huh?
Yeah, you're just like, how do I get out of this conversation alive? Right? How do I survive this? And that's not what you want out of business reviews. And by the way, CFOs feel that in board meetings too, right? So CFOs are on the other side of that.
Oh, I've been on the other side of that. I'm like, I sound so dumb right now.
Yeah. It's just like, I just want to get through unscathed. Can I get out of here unscathed? Because I would do that. Yeah, that's it. So, but it's really interesting. If you let people with a reward, like they can think more expansively, they can think in multiple contexts at once. You can't think in multiple contexts if you're being threatened, right? And so you do a bunch of of non-helpful things when you kind of focus on bad variance analysis, that kind of stuff. But that's the psychology around it. And again, every situation is different, right? If your PE firm wants the numbers and leads it with the numbers, you're going to leave with the number, right? It's like,
and part of the game is getting people to think that an idea was their idea. And
yeah,
you'd mentioned the CFO shouldn't always have a recommendation. And it feels kind of counterintuitive. Can you explain why sometimes like not recommending something is actually the smartest move?
yeah. Well, I'll give you one easy one, which is, do you really want to be on the hook for that recommendation, CJ?
Ooh,
Do you really want to be on the hook for that business launch?
probably not.
Probably not. Is it your job to make that decision? Or are you there to help other people make better decisions?
I think it's your job to guide people to a spot of positive risk-adjusted bets.
You're right. I like that framing, right?
Put them their spot on the floor where they can knock down a shot. That's my job.
There you go. I don't know if you read Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. It's a good read, but that's the CFO's job isn't to make those business decisions because we are not technically the business leader, right? We don't run a business. We're not the CEO, but we're there to enable good choice making, right? And we can guide people there. And, think of good, better, best. How many people take the good, the better, the best, right? Was it 80% of people take the good or the better, and 10% take the best, 10%, I don't know what it is. But so the trick is, and CFOs have always felt the need to make recommendations. Like finance has to have this recommendation. Number one, I don't think that's your job. Number two, it's not the best use of mental horsepower for you to be pushing a point of view on people who are hired to make business decisions. Right? It's their job to make those decisions. The CFO is not hired to do that job. Now you could argue, right? And CFOs are all over the board. You got CFOs who make decisions, make recommendations all the time. And so there's no blanket good bad here. However, right, it's my job though to say, okay, here's choice A. Choice A looks like this from an upside perspective, looks like this from a downside perspective. What's the midpoint? Probably here, right? If we model that out. Now, if we look at choice B, it looks like this, and this. Like I use arrows. Like we have this little construct we use where you just show choices in arrows with different most important parts of the drivers of the business model. And you just say, well, you make choice A, you see like 4 down arrows, and are those 2 up arrows worth all those down arrows? Now what you've done, right, is you've actually helped people develop a mental model of the decision. That's the sneaky thing that you do. That's incepting, right? And it's the sneaky thing that a CFO does. Or you ask the question. This is my favorite like Jedi mind trick that a CFO does. Man, that is amazing. I love the potential of this idea. If we could solve these 3 problems, I'm going to be your biggest backer. How long do you think it'll take you to solve these 3 problems?
Oh, that was great. Hook, line, and sinker. That's good.
How often does that idea come back to you after that?
Never. It's dead on arrival. But like you did that. There's an art in saying no without saying no. Yeah. And you also left the door open for that person to solve whatever challenges you had deemed, basically remove whatever hair was on that thing.
Yeah, right. So they got to go. They got to remove the hair. And by the way, the people that are passionate about it, that really can think through the systems thinking around it, they may give you a piece of gold, right? They may come back and give you that one piece of gold. Like this, one of the CFOs that kind of rotates in as faculty, he got into a new gig, and they do a restaurant support, right? There was a supply chain aspect to what they were seeing in the data, right? That was like this little hidden piece that was in all the data that this person came forward with. And it's like, look, I think there's actually, like, rather than a restaurant play, I think there's a supply chain play in here. And the CFO looked at it, was like, can you just tell me a little more about this? This is kind of interesting, right? Turned out, like, they solved a supply chain problem with a 90% margin, right? So, and it scales. So now they built a whole nother part of the business, right? That came off one of those ideas where it wasn't the doctor no. When the idea first came to him, it had hair on it. It wasn't perfect, but they were able to then do it. And so if you can get out of Dr. No, but also teach people how to think about the problem, that's the thing that I think your CFOs get scale out of. That's not, I don't know if I'm off piste or not, but where I think CFOs really lose value is helping people learn how to think through the business problem from the business model perspective, strategic perspective, et cetera. Because what happens then is finance gets less dumb ideas coming to finance. When you do have an idea that comes to finance, they've pre-thought it through. You're much more likely to get something that's, not a giant hairball, right? And the load on finance goes down, right? One of the biggest problems with the finance team is ad hoc asks that come in around dumb ideas.
To your point, you're making your own life easier because you're coaching people on how to come correct when you have an idea.
Yep. And then they come back, and by the way, they want to come back to you because they want CJ to look at this before they come up with their next idea, because they don't want to look dumb, right? And they want to come with good ideas, but they don't know how to think about it, right? And so, it's a big win. And the more you get people to think from a systems perspective around your business model, the less work finance has to do, the more that we can do the good stuff that helps them generate that next, level thinking.
You teased us with the idea that the hardest CFOs are actually the easiest to influence. What's the deal with that one? That's also kind of counterintuitive.
Right? That's one of my favorite ones. So when you find someone who just argues back immediately, right? And they haven't necessarily even fully listened to you, and they're arguing back strong, what's your take on why that person is doing that?
Why they default? No, I don't know. Maybe they've been burnt in the past.
There's something in there where they feel like they're trying to guard themselves from being influenced, from going down a road where they've been there, something they're passionate about. There's some good elements to work with there, right? So I used to get this because my job used to be to drop in with a group of 30 CFOs and spend 8 hours with them, right? So I'm the one who needed the hard hat.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine the spectrum of CFOs that you get, when you get manure companies to high tech companies and all of that. It's you end up with a whole interesting basket of CFOs.
Yeah.
But invariably, I would get at the beginning of an 8-hour day, because we always lead with something that's controversial, because we have paid to come up with new ways to think, right? And so that's obviously going to challenge the way someone's always thought about something, right? And so, but the people who argue back quick are people who are highly defensive, which means they're not really sure of their position, or they're people who are highly passionate, right? And so if you take a CFO like that and you sense that from the CFO, that CFO is actually probably your easiest to turn into a champion, right? Your biggest dissenters are usually your biggest opportunity to turn them into champions. So I'll give it so we were in Palo Alto. In Palo Alto, we would get this mix of high tech, but you'd also get this kind of bankers and, everything in between. We had a spring manufacturer show up in, Palo Alto before. And, I started the day off and I can't remember what we were talking about. It was some sort of, all my issues were strategic CFO issues, just because that's what interests me the most. So that's what we used to do. So we'd have the research team point at these big strategic CFO issues. And he goes, he starts off by going, I have never listened to so much HBS, that's Harvard business bullshit, in my entire life.
Yeah.
I can't believe, because we charge $35,000 a prescription. I can't believe I spent $35,000 to sit here and listen to this. And I can't remember the guy's name. I'll call him Frank, because he kind of looked like a Frank. And I was like, Frank, appreciate the thought. Just hang on to that. Tell me what things that you're having a problem with here. And he went on. He's like, this thing and that thing and the other thing. And he's looking around the room. He's looking for support. And, there's a couple head nods he's getting in the room. And he feels like little insurrection building, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. So I understand that you have this concern, that concern, the other concern. If we address these in the next couple hours, are you open to a new way of thinking? He can't say, no, I'm not open to a new way of thinking. Right?
Yeah, now he looks like the jerk.
Yeah, right. Are you open to a new way of thinking? By lunch, the guy was practically hugging me, right? Because he was so tied up in this because he built so much of his like career on one way of thinking of himself
and identity
as a CFO that I was kind of invalidating his career. But it doesn't mean he doesn't want to do better, right? And I found that every single time I'm in a situation, that the people I'm most worried about are the people who like kind of go along, get along. And I'm like, well, something's not right there. Right?
Something's not right.
Yeah, something's a little fishy.
It's just too easy. You haven't said anything in an hour, Dave.
But if you find a CFO who's like that, and that's the classic Dr. No CFO too, well, why would you be a Dr. No CFO if you truly understood the business? What you really want is a good business outcome, right? And so many CFOs have built their reputation, old school CFOs, on that piece. And so it's CFOs, but it works with everyone. If you find someone who's very in your face about something, like maybe the hardest pushback that you get, generally they become your biggest advocates. And it's just kind of a funny thing I found with their CFOs over the years, because then they want to call you all the time too. Like, hey, Scott, it's just going on.
That's so fascinating. If someone puts up a barrier really quick, it actually could be revealing that they feel vulnerable, that they don't have a position on it yet. So they say, well, I don't want to say yes to something immediately that could get me in trouble because I don't know enough yet. They're saying no just to like stave off whatever that is. Exactly. But like once you get past that, they're actually the most open to changing because they don't have a good formed thought on what it should be.
I think I think how you described it, like I would just end there, right? That I think is the biggest thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy.
And I think that applies across the C-suite, right? It's an interesting phenomenon. Like if I go into a room, because I've been in, that's what I used to get paid for. I know I'm in like for a brawl in the first hour from somebody, right? It's going to be the head of sales. It's going to be, if it's a cross-functional room. If it's a group of CFOs, there's going to be 3 CFOs who want to take me down, kind of a thing. I don't do that kind of stuff anymore, but it would always be those hardest people. And I would just I just embrace it, right? Like, embrace that thing and just say, look, just if you're open to it, I think we can address these problems as we go forward. Can we check in at lunch and we'll just take a temperature read, right? And is that cool?
It's a mental jiu-jitsu. I applaud you. The other wrestling match is trying to manage up CFO to CEO. And it feels like there's like an art and a science to managing your CEO. What's some advice you often give to CFOs who find themselves between a rock and a hard place there?
Yeah. I mean, this is like, especially in PE, right? This becomes the real, like, because, your boss is the CEO. Your CEO's boss is ultimately the deal partner, right? And in a PE situation, right? They're the ones who made the deal and they're going to sell the deal, right? So a couple things are, you've got to spend some time knowing what makes that CEO tick, right? Where are they coming from? I think the biggest mistake executives make is they don't spend some time just understanding what makes that person tick. Like in our accelerator, we talk about knowing people at 3 levels. There's a business context level. So what do they think about the business? What do they want to happen for the business? What does business success look like for them? Second one's a personal level. What do they personally want, right? Now, it may be like your CMO is business aligned, but the thing that you're trying to do for the business is going to not align with what they want personally. And you're going to get some pushback and you need to solve for that one. That's a CMO example. And then there's personal, like what do they think of you as a CFO? What's been their experience with CFOs? And what you want to do first is get a handle on what those 3 things are from them, right? Listen, what's most important to you from a business perspective? Have a personal conversation, would love to understand too how I could support whatever you're doing. And to the extent that you could have these conversations, it's a sliding scale. Some you can be really open with, some you're going to be very guarded, and, you've got to have some kind of EQ around that. But then, what's been their experience with CFOs in the past? What does great CFO relationship look like for them? And what does a poor CFO relationship look like for them? And how often have they had A or B? And by the way, like when we have CFOs who show people like our overview of the course, they go to the CEO and they go, look, this is all the stuff I could be doing. CEO's like, oh shit, I didn't know that, right? I didn't know a CFO could do all that stuff because they just have the context of the CFOs that they worked with, right? So you've got to understand like where your CEO is coming from. The other hack that we do is a social styles hack. I'm sure you've heard of DISC.
No, I haven't.
DISC, it's dominant, influencer, gosh, what are the other? It's a personality profile.
It's not frisbee disc golf. Okay, I thought it was something different. Okay.
Oh no, it's basically a personality snapshot. In PE, you're going to get a lot of dominance. There's dominant influencer, conscientiousness, and gosh, what's the S? It's driving me crazy. But
that's okay.
We use something called social styles, which are same basic concept. Someone is either a pusher or a puller. Like they're pushing to get something done, or they're pulling to get more information, and they want to ask a lot of more questions. The pusher is like, let's get this done. I'm going to run over some speed bumps and where you get there, right? The other is they're a little more task-oriented, a little more people-oriented. They're a little more emotive, or they're a little more factual. Now, if you've got someone who's a pusher, who's factual, that's a CEO who wants you to be good and be gone. I want to hear what you have to say. I'm going to get it out. I don't want you to waste my time, and I want you to get out of the room.
Yeah.
Right? And that's okay, right? That's completely cool as long as I know that. But if I have that kind of CEO and I'm going to do the deep analytical thing as a CFO, how's that going to play? They're going to hate me.
Well, yeah.
It goes against their value system because it's not their value system, right? Now you can say, look, we need to be a little more analytical here, and here's why, and do that piece of it. But then you have someone who's called, you get this CEO profile too, right? The expressive. The expressive is someone who's pushing big ideas all the time, right? And that's the classic CFO's got to reel them in, right? And all that. But that person really wants their ideas heard. You can't just shoot down every idea they have. You got to listen to the idea. You got to feed back the idea. You got to mirror back their language on the idea, right? And you've got to be someone who actually takes the big dream into account, but then can do the yes, if. Yes, it's a great idea if we can solve for it, Or they could be people-oriented. They call them amiables, and there are people who are pullers, but they're more people-oriented, more emotive. And they really care about people, and they care, and it may not be you, right? As a CFO, I work with CFOs, I'm a little more on the task side. I'm a little more on the numbers side of the equation, right? But there are people who are very people-oriented. And if you start, if you lead with numbers that are getting people fired that person cares about, they may look at you and go, that's not a good partner. Mm-hmm. And especially in private equity, because it's likely you're going to have to advocate to get rid of someone on the senior team at some point if you're a CFO.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to understand if you're dealing with that personality type. So we think of these three levels, right, of knowing it. And then it's how do you manage with that CFO or CEO? Tell me what's most important to you. Of the top 10 things I could be working on, what's most important to you? And how does that align with what our PE sponsor wants?
Yeah.
Right. And then managing around that CEO, it's so when you know what your social style is, right, of the CEO, there are three levels that they're hitting. You pretty much, if you're smart enough, you can craft a way to work with that CEO. But then there's how do I work with them with regard to the PE sponsor? Your deal partner thinks X, your CEO thinks Y, and you think Z. Now you've got a loyalty and direct line of reporting to your CEO. You've got ultimately your deal partner is the CEO's boss, right? They own the company, right? And you have a fiduciary responsibility to them. And you're ultimately going to be on the hook for your MOIC, right? Your multiple uninvested capital, right? On the end of it. So how do you manage that? Your CEO is out of line with your deal partner and your operating partner. So, there's no perfect way, but the thing that's come up again and again in our sessions is you've got to be frank with the CEO. Go, look, I understand you think X. It looks like there are problems with that. It's my job to help the deal partner, the operating partner, understand both sides of this. How do you want to handle this? Because I have to tell them.
Yeah. We were talking to Rick Smith, who's a 5-time venture-backed, PE-backed CFO, and he called it, I think, the triangle of doom. I thought it was the triangle of death at first, but I think he called it the triangle of doom. Yeah. And you have the CEO, the CFO, and the board. And the CFO is unfortunately at the weakest point of that triangle because there are conversations that go on that you're not a part of between the CEO and board. And the CEO is technically your boss, but you have a fiduciary responsibility, which is a very different thing than everybody else in the C-suite who reports to the CEO. And you have to let the shareholders who have a vested interest in this know when something's up. So it's probably the trickiest spot to be in, managing both sides of that equation.
Yeah, and the real solve for this is to keep really open lines of communication with all parties to the extent. Here's what happens to, I don't want to call them bad CFOs, but CFOs who get put in the outbox. You find you get less information. You find you get information after the fact.
It's like a quiet death where you're getting less and less info.
Nope, that's your telltale sign. Are people coming to you upstream of a decision, or are they coming to you downstream of a decision, right? That's my tell, right? I call it the push-pull thing, right? Are people pulled into your office, or do you have to push to get information? If you find you're pushing all the time, it means you probably set yourself up in bad relational situations.
Yeah.
But, operating partner, sit down with your operating partner. What's most important to you? Like, what are the 10 things I need to be working on? And I just talked to my CEO. These are the 10 things. How do you feel about that? Call them up, ask them opinions. You want to keep those lines of communication open on all parties so that you get as much information as you can, so you don't end up in that triangle of doom, right? Where there are things happening outside your control. And by the way, when you find yourself encountering situations again and again where you are the last to know, you better get your resume out there.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you're
time's up.
You've been put in the outbox, right? And that's unfortunately the case in PE CFO land, is rip and replace. Once you've lost confidence, it becomes rip and replace. They don't have a rehab, performance plan for the CFO.
Yeah, you can't go to Malibu and win trust back on like a 30-day program.
No, it's not.
Scott, I want to gear towards a close here and ask you a couple questions around the temperature of the market right now, particularly for PE-backed CFOs. And we opened the pod with saying that so many sponsors are not satisfied with the people they have in seats. And so we probably have a ton of people listening who are like, maybe I can be that guy or girl who can fill that role. So what's the best way for an up and coming CFO to get on the radar of a private equity portfolio company to get a gig?
It's a really good question, right? Best number one way is to work in a PE environment, maybe as, a number two in there, right? Because what they want is, does this person get the cadence, the expectation, right? What they're really trying to solve for is risk. Because remember, your GP has to answer to the LPs. And if they hire a CFO who hasn't a PE experience, it's like you could have hired Deloitte, but you hired Joe Schmo Consulting. You're not going to get fired for hiring Deloitte, but you're going to get fired if you hire Joe Schmo and Joe Schmo messes up, right? Now, if you're the private equity firm and you have to answer to your LPs, do you want to tell them the story of the portco that failed because you hired a CFO who hadn't had PE experience before, right? So that's
de-risk yourself to be chosen, you're saying?
Yep. Yeah, so there's a de-risking aspect to why there's this conundrum of, we don't like the PE CFOs we have. There aren't any good PE CEOs out there, and there are a lot of CFOs who want to be PE CFOs, right? That's the sort of, there's like the arbitrage in here that I'm trying to help solve for, right, around all this. So that's one thing you have to realize, like there's a de-risking aspect to this, that they want people who've been there, done that before. Now, there are PE shops that don't require PE, but that's probably on the smaller side of it, right? So then you have to understand, what do they expect, right? We look at 5 different leadership capabilities: stakeholder management, insight leadership, like driving the next decision, transformational change management, enterprise leadership, cross-functional, operational, getting your hands dirty, performance leadership, driving the pace, driving alignment, making sure that you're looking at the assumptions that underpin the investment thesis, ownership mentality, all that kind of stuff. Now, the way that we set it up with our non-PE CFOs who want to get in, we're like, look, you need to talk the language of private equity. When you get into this, when you do get your at-bat, you need to talk in the right language. You need to talk in terms of the investment thesis, value creation plan, ask for the value creation plan, right? A lot of CFOs don't even know the basic terminology around what happens in a private equity situation. And so they're going to be in an interview environment, they're going to blow themselves out really quick. The other thing they'll do is they'll take, and I guess I'll do this from the bad side and we'll get to the good side. But the other thing they'll do is they'll set themselves up to fail by saying, when I was at Unilever, we put together a 20-person team that did this thing and we had this impact, right? It's not going to happen. That just tells your executive recruiter, it tells, the talent partner, it tells the CEO that you don't understand what this job is, right? When you say, here's what happened at the last gig, right? We had a product market fit problem, and our head of product was off the rails, right? We were creating a whole bunch of shit we can't sell. It was really cool stuff, but we couldn't sell it. We had to get in at the product level, do some analysis, bring that up. We had to do an end around on the head of product with the CEO and change out that head of product. And when we did that, we were able to reorient what we did on the product side. We were able to get that go-to-market fit. We were able to scale that quickly. And this is what it did from a numbers perspective, like something like that, or territory, that they want to hear that grit, that operational know-how, that cross-functional nature. They do not want to hear I reported on numbers. And, this was the analysis I did, right? Or this was the big thing I put together, right? And so it's understanding that. And so if you're going to position yourself, how do your past experiences, drive business success? What did you do that wasn't a finance siloed thing, right? Like, this is what we did in finance, right? Okay, but flow through to business impact. So You nail those stories. So we ask people to put together narratives around performance leadership, enterprise leadership, transformational leadership, all that. And actually, one of our CFOs created a schematic where she took her whole backstory and fit it into this matrix. And as she interviews, she talks about it. But now you can talk about it in the right context. You need to research your private equity, research what the heck it is, right? Know what deal partners are, know what operating partners are, understand the ecosystem, understand the trade-offs, that you have to manage stakeholders. If you get in there and you're talking about, because you have to manage the deal part, because, you're in those board meetings, right? And so you've got the deal partners at the board meetings. You've got to manage that ecosystem, and you've got to show how you've done that stuff and help them overcome their risk profile on you, right? Which is that person hasn't done it before. So I think being able to reorient your past into the context of that, finding places where you can get in maybe as a number two. One of the best things to do is you get it, it's always great when this works out. You get in as a VP with a CFO, you get a turn in 2 years and you're out, and then you're CFO. Somewhere, right? That's being getting into private equity environments where you can, right? And getting those reps, but orienting your history towards it, showing you're an operational CFO, and really being able to ride the context of what they want. Because they're only asking for PE experience because they want the subcategories of PE experience, right? They want to know that you can manage stakeholders. They want to know that you can go sell this to a secondary. They can sell this to a strategic. So you need to think about your past with that, get the experience that you can. People love exits. They love successful exits, right? It's like being a made man in the mafia.
Yeah.
If you can get on a ride like that, that could be a great way. And then the other thing is to get into a VC growth position where, you can graduate up in revenue. I think what you scale to 150 or 200, something like that, last time, right? So you're in PE space, right? If you can get into a growth situation where you can show your chops, you're working with a growth equity firm that's got some rep. So all those things they look at, but you need to button up your past in a context that makes sense for what PE wants.
Yeah, you got to package it the right way, and I think it goes a long way, because if correct me if I'm wrong, but many of these CFOs do multiple stints with the same sponsor, right?
Less than you think. That does have, it absolutely, and it's a thing that sponsors want. They want to keep
because they call it a tour of duty. Like, you're going to come back and do another one after you sell this company.
Yeah. So, and those are there's this one guy that we worked with a while back, right? He left for a year, traveled the world with his son, came back, and he had 3 jobs open, but he also had other private equity firms knocking on his door too. They like to keep you in-house, but there really isn't a systematized approach to do that at most private equity firms.
Okay.
And so they say it, they want it. And if you're someone who's done it and you get a turn, they'll definitely want you back. But they don't have a systemized approach for grooming. That's actually happening right now. I'm working with 2 different private equity firms designing some in-house training because they're trying to create this retention wheel internally. But it's something that it's just not systematized.
Because they talk about, we want to keep you in the family. It's like, okay, well, what's the retention mechanism there? What do you just call them when a job comes up? Is there any formalized process for this?
That's a little bit of the problem, right? It's situational. They have to have the right opening at the right time. And you're going to be, if you're a successful CFO, you're going to be approached with a bunch of other jobs too. So
how does comp look in the market today for a PE-backed CFO? And you don't have to give specific numbers or anything, but is it getting better, worse? Are companies putting more weight on the importance of this role and wanting to compensate it better?
So I think it was growing and it's kind of leveled off.
Okay.
But it's leveled off into a decent spot, right? So the way they think about it is you've got salary, you've got cash bonus, and then you've got your equity, right? The bulk of your payday is going to come on the equity side. The hard part for a CFO is to evaluate what that equity is worth. You can get 1% of one company, and that's worth a lot less than
I could talk about this for 3 hours.
Yeah. It's like, and so, obviously you got to look at the comp equation, and the comp equation looks like, what's my salary? What's my likely bonus? What's the likelihood of an exit within what period and at what
so important
price?
Yeah.
And then you got to kind of work backward from there. And then you got to, trust a little bit. There's one CFO I know who's sitting on a $35 million exit, right? He's just got to get there. Right. And then there's others who were promised $18 million exits, on paper, right? We just model this out for you. And they're leaving before, they're leaving before their third year because they're underwater and there's no chance that they're going to get there.
Well, to that point, what's your recommendation about evaluating an offer and negotiating the equity package of that? Because that's the biggest mover in the equation. Like, I think everybody out there can probably hone in on what a good cash comp range is. And for each person, sometimes you need a little bit more in where you are in life. Sometimes you need a little bit less. But like, why we do it is for the equity outcome, if we're being real about it. Should you be negotiating from a fully diluted ownership perspective? Like, hey, I want 1%. I want 1.25%. Or should you be negotiating based on like a dollar amount that they put to work?
Well, one interpolates to the other, right? So if you look at 1% at current price, current cash value of that 1% is X. The projected value of that, if we get to our goal, is going to be Y. And so it actually all comes out like it doesn't matter if you look at it from a dollar perspective or a percent perspective, because one translates to the other as far as what you're going to get. And so, generally, in a PE decent sized deal, like you're looking at, a $5 million plus, outcome that you're running towards, and it can go a lot higher than that. I think the average CEO benchmark is about 10 million that you're looking for on the equity side, but it's hard to know how those numbers are going to be playing out with the extended hold periods and some of the sideways movement that we're seeing in the PE market right now.
And just to put that into perspective, when it's all said and done, you hope that you walk away pre-tax with like 5 million, you're saying, right?
Yeah. So at 5,
that's the outcome, not the amount at work that could, like, if you triple, it goes to 15 or something.
Yeah. You're walking away with like, 5 to, 20 million is kind of right. A broad range, 20 on the high end, 5 on the lower range, depending if you're mid-size and what level.
But you can see how that stacks up.
But yeah, the numbers are out. Hydric has some good numbers on it. They put out a CFO report every year.
Yeah, I saw that. Your LinkedIn post on that was amazing. And you can see how it stacks up if you're able to do 3 roles over, 12 years, like 5 million, 10 million a clip. Like, that's great money.
Yeah, right. And then you're done, right? And that's why people want to be in the PE game. The mitigating factor is that, we're not turning over as many PE deals as we thought we would. Yeah. There's 5,000 companies backed up.
Wow. Well, maybe to end on like just your view on where things are going now, what's the biggest challenge for PE-backed CFOs today?
It is really becoming like that performance driver, I think, is the key thing, and all the stuff that comes with it, right? Being able to navigate the stakeholder ecosystem, being able to drive that relationship with the CEO, being able to drive business value. It's that credibility, it's mastery of the numbers. The big thing, though, is right now, you can't financially engineer your way to big MOICs anymore, right? Multiple uninvested capital. Just because of where interest rates are at LBOs. You used to be able to go, you buy the house, right? You put an addition on the house, you pay 4%, and then the market goes up 20%. You're going to make money even if you did a shitty job putting the addition on the house. Now you've got to do a really nice job on the house, right? You've got to really think, do you need the pool or not need the pool, right? And you've got to be judicious in arming the org. And I would say the flip side of that is, not to go to the negative side, but you got to be a cutthroat rationalizer. You got to be able to do that in a way that makes people feel positive momentum. That's the art, right? It's like, we're going to sunset this product line, and there's a reason, because we need to fund XYZ. And we need to put our best people on it. You got to rationalize your products. You got to rationalize your businesses sometimes. You got to rationalize your people. And you have to do all of that with a sense of what is truly going to create value, because you can't cut your way to growth especially in the environment that you're in. I mean, you may be able to take, like, there's one org where I'm talking to the CEO where he's coming in and he's gonna cut his way to a nice profit margin, but he's got a year and a half, 2-year run on that, and then he's gonna have to find new growth, right? And so the CFO has to understand the investment thesis, but also understand the business reality and how to translate that. And you really got to position yourself as this translator. Like, we talk about all the hats and the tools, the tool belt. You need that Batman tool belt, right? And you need to listen to people like you, right? And the other people who are thought leaders out there, and get ideas and constantly be refreshing, because it's moving really fast now. And I think the real challenge is, are you an A player, right? Are you truly an A player? Will they pay for you? Are you in the top 10 percentile? If not, you've got to figure out a way to get there and to find the resources. And that I think is the biggest challenge. And then when you get into those situations, you got to flex your EQ, right? You got to know people from multiple dimensions. You got to, all that stuff.
That's an amazing place to cap this off. Scott, this has been an absolute pleasure. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate all your market perspective.
Yeah, dude, this is great. I was looking forward to this. I told my wife, I was like, yeah, we're going to have some fun. This is going to be good.
We're going to have you back for round 2 at some point later this year.
Love it. When I start up my own podcast, we're gonna flip roles, man. We're going to go the other way.
We'll run it back. Yeah, I love it. Well, thanks, Scott.
All right. Thanks, CJ.
Run the Numbers is a mostly LLC production. Yelling an intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by some AI thingamajig. Podcast and video editing is done by Cleancast at cleancast.io. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses, LOL. If you like this podcast, please hit subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And also check out mostlymetrics.com. That's my newsletter where I explore business models and financial metrics. Thanks for riding with me. Share this with your friends. Peace.